So we were discussing this topic, gender and education attainment, and there were a couple of subtopics that we had over here. Amongst them, we had gender and subculture. And while discussing gender and subculture in the last lesson, we had discussed this study that was conducted by Dr. Michael Ward. And this study was about young working class boys. There were 32 boys in total, and how if we talk about a comparison of this particular study with the study that was conducted by Paul Willis in the year 1977. Uh, if you remember, Paul Willis had studied these two distinctively different groups. That is the lads and year olds. This study, if you go through this study, you'd come across a lot of similarities between that particular study and this study. And the two groups that we are referring to in this study that was conducted by Ward was the boys and the geeks. And taking this ahead, we had spoken about what Ward thought about his study, and what he concluded. He had found out that, or he felt like, both the groups, that is the boys and the geeks, they had adapted to deindustrialization in a different way. And then we had evaluated the study by Ward, and all of this was covered in the last lesson. So today, as we begin, we would discuss this study that was conducted by Louise Archer. Now, this study that was conducted by Louise Archer, we would start off with this one, followed by this particular study. We'd move on and discuss another study that was conducted by Alexandra Allen, followed by another study that was conducted by Miss Farzana Shane. Here you go. So this is what I plan on covering today. To begin with, this study that was conducted by Louise Archer. Now, Louise Archer in 2013, that is not that's a relatively recent study. Louise Archer, or rather say Archer, in 2013 conducted a research on Muslim boys in education. Now, when we talk about Muslim boys over here, we're talking about these Muslim boys who were mostly from the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi origin. There were 31 boys in total on whom this research was conducted. Archer wanted to see how these young Muslim boys in the UK, they saw themselves. I mean, what was the perception they held about themselves and the identities they carried, how they saw the schooling process, and how they saw the future to be like. So this study that was conducted by Archer, this study is about young Muslim boys who were around 14 to 15 years old, and uh, how the educational experiences they had, or how their schooling experiences had, rather say the educational experiences were being impacted by the identities they carried. So 31 Muslim boys, typically from the Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin, they age range from 14 to 15 years. Archer tried collecting her data through discussion groups, which are also referred to as focus groups. So this data that was gained, this information that was collected was typically done by three different interviewers. And if we talk about these three different interviewers, amongst these three different interviewers, there were two females who were from a Pakistani origin, who were Britishers, but they came from a Pakistani, they had a Pakistani background. And on the other hand, the third interviewer over here was Louise Archer herself, who was a white British middle class woman. Now, data being collected through discussion groups, it's pretty important that we understand that these discussion groups, or so referred to as these focus groups, have their own pros and they have their own cons too. Now, there are a lot of pros, there are a lot of cons that we could associate to focus groups. Amongst the pros could be the extent to which boys, or anyone who is a part of a focus group, the extent to which an individual's opinions might change or might be affected by the collective group. Or in other words, when you talk about focus groups are a discussion. They're more like an informal, or rather say a guided discussion. Guided, I'm using the word guided over here because the moderator or the researcher, that might be also referred to as an interviewer, does not want the conversation to get derailed, and yeah, does not want the conversation to get derailed. So as many as advantages as focus groups have, they have their own cons too. Amongst those cons, remember, when you are discussing, when you are when you're having a conversation, there might be certain things you might agree to, others you might disagree to, you might want to debate on some. But remember, when you're a member of a particular group and you know there are other people around you, the likelihood of your answers being affected because of the likely possible audience you have is always there. So there's a possibility whatever the information was that was being received by these three female interviewers might have had their its influence of the group that was there. Or let's just say these were young 14 to 15-year-old boys. Let's just say because these boys knew that the researchers were there, they might have changed their or altered their responses or altered their points of discussion. So to begin with, what was the aim of the study? The aim of this study was to see how these young boys they constructed and negotiated their masculine identities. We're talking about Muslim boys predominantly from Pakistan and Bangladesh, the age ranging from 14 to 15 years. These boys were used to live in UK. Now, Archer wanted to figure out the extent to which these identities, the masculine identities of these boys, might be constructed and then negotiated. There are two aspects that we're talking about over here. Number one, construction of an identity. Number two, negotiation of an identity. Now, let's have a look at what these young boys felt about their Muslim identities. Now, these young boys, they identified themselves first and foremost to be Muslims. A very typical, I'd say, South Asian way to deal with things. I mean, Alhamdulillah to this, but uh, merely the act of identifying yourself as a Muslim doesn't finish the job. And what Archer found out was, despite of the fact that these young boys, they held pride in identifying themselves as a Muslim first, they did not act accordingly, or their actions or their behavior did not reflect any such thing. Now, she exemplifies this by giving an example that these young boys, they weren't even regular when it came to Friday prayers. Now, almost all of them were born in England. They did not feel they belonged in England. Now, we're talking about the Muslim identities that these young boys carried. These young boys, 14 to 15-year-old boys, the Muslim identity that they carried. According to Archer, despite of the fact that most of these boys, they were born in England, they never saw themselves belonging to England. One. Number two, if we move on and we talk about their gender identities. Remember, we are trying to, or rather say, Archer was trying to figure out the construction as well as the negotiation of different identities. As we speak about gender identities over here, these boys complained that teachers unfairly favored girls. Now, remember, the keyword over here is gender. We're talking about gendered identities over here. And before this, we had spoken about a religious identity that was their Muslim identity. Now, these young boys, they complained that the teachers unfairly favored young girls, which led to the examination success. Now, these boys felt like girls were they were aware, and they were aware that girls now were outperforming boys in academics, and instead of giving credit to girls, they saw this as mere favoritism that was done by teachers to facilitate females do better. Now, these young boys, they passed very laddish remarks, very absurd remarks, very mean remarks. They tried messing around, having a laugh, and this could be seen as attributes, or this could be seen as characteristics of a macho masculinity. Their gender identities also reflected their Asian Muslim subculture. Now, when you talk about your South Asian Muslim subculture, men in our part of the world, they're expected to be breadwinners. So these young boys saw themselves as future breadwinners. They felt like they had more freedom, liberty, and autonomy as compared to females. They felt like they very well deserved the amount of power they had. They felt like they had a duty to ensure that women showed conformity to their own definitions of patriarchal femininity. So a very South Asian thing, which I don't think anyone would have any issue understanding. So, the gendered identity that these young boys possessed was affected, and it reflected their South Asian Muslim subcultural attributes too. Now, these young boys, they felt that females should be respectable when it came to appearance and when it came to clothing, and when they felt like I'm talking about these young boys, right? They felt like if females did not conform to their own notions of clothing the way or appearing to be the way they had ideally wanted them to be, they referred to them being out of control. Now, we're talking about young boys. We're talking about young boys who were 14 to 15-year old. And the gendered identity that they carried was, I mean, a part of it was them considering themselves responsible for how females were, what they were wearing, what they were doing. And if anyone did not abide by, or if anyone did not uh, follow their own prescribed notions of femininity, they were seen to be out of control. Now, taking this a little further, and if we try focusing and emphasizing on the breadwinner identity, remember this breadwinner identity, it came from here. Now, we just trying to elaborate on this particular point. How South Asian men see themselves as future whole soul breadwinners. Now, as we speak about them, the idea that these young boys carried about them being breadwinners, these boys saw themselves as future breadwinners. That's understandable. They felt like education played an important role to help them perform this role. So these boys knew for a fact that tomorrow, as they grow older, it would be assumed that they would be the breadwinners for the family, and they pretty much were in line with the idea that education, to quite an extent, plays a very important role in terms of helping an individual be able to perform this role. Now, at the same time, these young boys, they felt racism did discourage them, because despite of the fact that they wanted to study, and in some cases they did study and achieve, they felt like they had to face a lot of discrimination. They had to face a lot of prejudice and they had to face a lot of racism when it came to them getting jobs. And of course, if they're not getting jobs, then the option they're left with is to fall into family business. The next point that I'd like discussing here, they described family life as in a very overwhelmingly positive terms. So for these young boys, family was important, and they felt pride, or they saw being a breadwinner being a symbol of masculinity, and they held pride in seeing themselves as future breadwinners. Let me read this. They described family life in overwhelmingly positive terms. For them, successfully performing the role of a breadwinner for the family was seen as a source of pride and a symbol of masculinity. Now, if we try scrutinizing this study, if we try evaluating this study that was conducted by Louise Archer in the year 2013, which was about young boys, and how these young boys had constructed and negotiated their gendered identities. Typically, the gendered identities, we had also spoken about the religious identity, that is a Muslim identity, their religious identity, that is a Muslim identity. Now, if we try evaluating Archer here, this particular study illustrates that identities are changeable and complex, and they're always in the process of construction and reconstruction. One. Number two, the data that Archer and her colleagues gathered came from a small discussion group led by two Pakistani origin and one British origin woman. Remember, I had said interviewer effect could come into place over here, right? The next point, there's a possibility. I mean, this is a good thing. Let's make a tiny little smile over here. However, these two should be seen as flaws. Now, the boy's projection of particularistic identities might have been affected by his audience or their audience, because remember, there were other members that were there in the discussion group too. So there's a possibility. I mean, in their defense, we could say that the boys were trying to be a little I mean, they were trying to be the way they did because perhaps they had an idea that there were other people who were with them. There were other people who were listening. There were two female interviewers, or in this case, you may also refer to them as moderators too. Now, this research that we just discussed, that was conducted by Louise Archer in the year 2013, is a reference that could be used under the heading gender and subculture. Let me remind you all, the topic that we're discussing today is gender and subculture. In our last lesson, we had discussed a study that was conducted by Michael Ward, which again was a recent study that was conducted in 2015. Today, we started off with Louise Archer, and she conducted a research in 2013. Taking this ahead, let's talk about female subcultures, which again is a gendered subculture. And this particular study that we would be discussing over here was conducted by Alexandra Allen. Now, this study that was conducted by Allen in the year 2010. So this study was also conducted in 2010 on the study that was conducted by Farzana Shane that we would be discussing after we done with Allen was conducted in 2010 as well. Now, about Alexandra Allen, she conducted a research on the female subcultures within schools. Now, we talk about these young girls who were labeled later as rebel girls. So these young girls that we're talking about, from whom this data was collected by Allen. What Allen did was she conducted a 2-year study. This study was on 25 middle class young girls who were aged 11 to 12 years. They attended a single sex school, and the school was amongst the high achieving schools, which is a good thing. Now, taking this ahead, according to Allen, the teachers saw some girls as underachievers. Remember, this might have changed the self concept that these young girls carried. Now, when we talk about self concept, we may be able to link this with interactionism. This again could be an example of an in school factor, or the factors within school that affect the educational attainment of pupils. So, teachers saw some girls as underachievers, and these young girls, they were seen by other girls to be rebels, to be bad girls, and to ones who would misbehave. Now, they were labeled as rebels, as bad girls and misbehaviors because they wouldn't hesitate playing practical jokes. These girls saw it was uncool. They felt it was uncool when it came to working. So, these young girls, in the study that was conducted by Alexandra Allen conducted this research in the year 2010. And this study, like I said, was conducted on 25 middle class girls. This study took 2 years. This was conducted on 11 to 12-year-old girls. They used to attend a single sex school, which again was a high achieving school. Taking this a little further, these rebels were mostly from middle class, yet they saw themselves as lacking the knowledge or the know-how to compete with posh girls. Now, what Allen noted was, despite of the fact that these young girls were from the middle class, they saw themselves, I mean, they had this, if I put it in a very casual manner, they had this inferiority complex, or the perception that these young girls held about themselves was very different from whom they saw as the posh girls. Now, according to Allen, these girls, whom we're referring to as the rebels over here, these young girls saw or felt like that these posh girls, they were attaining more because their parents would use their money. I've zoomed this in over here, and if you see, it's written over here in green, that these young girls, the posh girls, rebels felt that these posh girls felt their parents had used their money to make them clever. And these young girls felt that they did not have the knowledge. They felt like they felt that they did not have the know-how to be able to compete with these young girls. One. Number two, these young girls were seen to be downplaying the importance of academic achievement. They were seen to be downplaying the importance of academic achievement. They at during their time at school, they did not perhaps show the amount of respect, the amount of amount of conformity that they should have, or that is expected from a student to show when you're attending school. So it wouldn't be wrong for us to say that these young girls, they downplayed the importance of academic achievement, taking it ahead. And because these young girls, these girls whom we're referring to as the rebels over here, because they felt like they were not good enough to be able to compete with these posh girls, this could probably be a defense mechanism. This was a defense mechanism that they were trying to use to be able to protect their self-worth, because they somehow saw themselves as being somehow inferior. They acted the way they did as a defense mechanism. Now, despite of everything being said and done, what counts over here is their performance in terms of national examination. These rebels, I mean, despite of the fact that their experience or the amount of time that they spent at school wasn't really very favorable towards the school norms, the school's rules and regulations, despite of that, these young girls, they ended up performing really well when it came to national examinations. However, they never did well when it came to the schools, though. So we were discussing this study now that was conducted by Alexandra Allen. Allen conducted this research in the year 2010. Taking this ahead, let's move on and bring another study over here and bring another study under discussion over here. This study again had to do with female subcultures, and this one was on British Asian girls, or we may also refer to them as South Asian girls. This study was conducted by Shane in the year 2010. The sample comprised of 44 Asian girls, age ranged between 13 to 16 years. They were mostly from Pakistani background. This data was collected from 8 different schools that were located in an economically deprived area. Now, what Shane did was Shane tried categorizing, typifying, classifying, or putting these 44 Asian girls. She tried distributing them or putting them into 4 different type of groups. Now, these are the 4 different type of groups that I'm referring to over here. The first one being gang girls, the second one being the survivors, the third category was the rebels, and the fourth one being faith girls. So this categorization or this grouping was done by Farzana Shane. Now, how is it that these gang girls were different from the survivors, from the rebels and the faith girls? So, I mean, ahead we discuss how Shane saw these gang girls, but for now, to be able to differentiate amongst these 4 different groups that were that were grouped by Shane herself. Now, when we talk about gang girls here, these gang girls, it was seen that they opposed school culture. One. Number two, they saw the school being very racist in favor of white people. And as a reaction, perhaps they emphasized more on their Asian culture, on the South Asian culture, which might have been the reason why many of them they withdrew or kept themselves away from other students. So they tried excluding themselves from other students. They tried keeping themselves away from other students. The first category, the first group over here, which we refer to as the gang girls. Moving on, if we talk about the second category over here, Shane referred to them as the survivors. Who are these survivors now? These survivors showed more of conformity towards school values. They tried achieving academic success. They did experience racism, they did experience sexism, but they tried foregoing it because for them, they probably had a bigger picture in mind. They wanted to focus on academic success, they wanted to focus on academic achievement. The third category that we have over here are the rebels. And these rebels that we're talking about, they were very critical of the unequal gender relationship that they saw was there within their home communities. Remember, we're talking about South Asian girls. Remember this group that we're talking about that Shane conducted a research on, predominantly comprised of Pakistani girls. And as you all would be aware of how Pakistani societies are like, more true in the rural parts of our country, but it wouldn't be wrong for someone to say that despite of the changes our societies, despite of the social evolution our societies have experienced, even today to this date, there is to some degree or the other. I'm not saying everyone's the same. I'm not saying every family is the same. I'm not saying every social group is the same. I'm not saying every society is the same. But despite of there being global changes, despite of the enormous amount of changes that our societies have experienced, even today there are some families, there are some communities where there are unequal gender relationships that are to be found within home communities. So we're talking about this distribution that was done by Farzana Shane. Farzana Shane conducted a research in the year 2010. The fourth category over here is of the faith girls. Now, as the name suggests, these faith girls, they prioritized religion. These faith girls, they prioritized religion. They tried integrating well with other communities, unlike the gang girls. Number two. Number three, these faith girls, they use survival strategies for academic success. So these young girls that we're talking about, they were more inclined towards religion. They tried prioritizing religion. They did not mind. In fact, they were seen to be integrating, or they were seen to be they were seen to be integrating with other non-Pakistani or non South Asian communities too, and as a survival strategy so that they could achieve what they had initially joined the school for at the first place. They tried being nice to everyone. So taking this a little further and emphasizing and focusing on these gang girls. Let me repeat, we're talking about the study that was conducted by Farzana Shane. Farzana Shane conducted this research in 2010. This research was conducted on British Asian girls. There were 44 Asian girls who were from the age bracket 13 to 16 years. They were mostly from Pakistani origin. This data was collected from 8 different schools and schools that were located in economically deprived areas. So there was these 4 different groups that Farzana Sheen came up with. The first one being gang girls, the second one being survivals, the third one being rebels, and the fourth one being faith girls. Now, about these gang girls, Shane tried exploring this particular subculture a little more in detail. So there's more of focus on gang girls. That was the first category that we had. Now, according to Shane, these gang girls, they were labeled by their teachers as underachievers. Remember, your self concept, remember interactionism, remember self fulfilling prophecy. Now, these young girls, they were labeled by their teachers as underachievers, and not only were they labeled by the teachers as underachievers, they were placed into lower sets. And there have been numerous researches that we have discussed in the previous lessons where we've spoken about how your placement as an individual in a particular ability group, that is in this context, in this case a particular set, could affect not only your educational experiences but your overall educational attainment too. So these young girls, they were labeled by teachers as underachievers. These young girls, they were placed in lower sets. Now, I'm sure you'd all agree to this. When you're placed in a lower set, this not only affects your friendship patterns, but along with this affects your educational experiences as well. This affects your academic experiences as well. This affects your social experiences as well. So by the mere act of placing a particular individual into an ability group, your entire educational experience could get affected. Your entire educational experience over here includes your academic and non-academic aspects, that is social aspects too. Taking this further, these young girls, if we talk about the perception teachers held about them, teachers saw these young girls, that is these girls from the gang, I mean these gang girls, which was amongst the four different groups that we had, these the teacher's perception about them was that they are troublemakers, that they deserved to be in the lower sets, that they were academic failures, and these young girls would gradually withdraw from school. Remember, self-fulfilling prophecy. What does the word prophecy mean? Prophecy means prediction. Prophecy means prediction. So if a teacher has a particular perception about you, the likelihood that the teacher might eventually end up communicating that to you, either directly or indirectly, either overtly or covertly. But if somehow, some way or the other, the teacher, through the interaction you have with the teacher, communicates to you that the teacher doesn't really have expectations from you, that might consequently lead to educational underachievement. Now, taking this ahead, these young girls, what Shane also found out was that these young girls, they did experience racial abuse, racial discrimination, and instead of giving into it, these young girls, they fought back. So they fought back the racial discrimination they experienced, and for them, their and for them, their Asian identity, their South Asian identity had more of meaning than anything or anyone else. And they tried, and this pretty much reflected in what in their attire too. So these young girls, they were seen to be wearing traditional dresses. They would, in fact, they were so rigid about, they were so rigid, they were so, what's the word we use about for this? They were so rigid, they were so, so I can't think of the word. So they were so possessive about their group. They were so strict about the group members that if any member of that particular group tried interacting or tried being friends with anyone who was white, or for the matter of fact, any one who was not a South Asian, they would simply exclude that particular girl from the group as well. So these young girls that Farzana Sheen conducted a research on, she put these girls into four different categories. The first one was the gang girls. The second one over here was the survivors, the third was the rebels, and the fourth was the faith girls. Now, according to Shane, these gang girls, they formed an all Asian female subcultural group. And of course, you being a part of a particular group of such nature not only changes the perception that teachers hold about you, but it also changes your or it also influences or affects your educational experience, your educational journey, which might consequently affect your educational attainment as well. So if I recall what all we have covered today, there were three different key thinkers that we took into account today. We initially spoke about Louise Archer, and followed by the research that was conducted by Alexandra Allen. And towards the end, we spoke about the study that was conducted by Farzana Shane. I hope this was helpful.